We're going to be talking about the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine and the implications in terms of both opportunities and challenges for neuropsychiatric diseases. And as you'll see, we have a very broad-based panel. And what we'll be doing is we'll have each of our panelists will be making a few minutes presentation about how they see the opportunities and challenges for neuropsychiatric diseases in relationship to CIRM, and then we'll have a discussion. So sort of to start this off, I just wanted to introduce to you why we're having this discussion. And that is that a lot of people don't know that in 2020, in the general election, California voters passed Proposition 14, which refunded the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine for at least 10 more years. And this created not only the opportunity to advance stem cell science in the state and continue what had been done in the previous iteration of CIRM that had been funded several years previously, but it also created an historic opportunity to advance our understanding, treatment, and prevention of diseases of the brain, because the voters, as part of this initiative, set aside $1.5 billion for this purpose. And the referendum language specifically emphasized neuropsychiatric disorders, including schizophrenia, depression, autism, and others. And the referendum also emphasized that the funds must be used in a manner to decrease health disparities and inequities throughout the state. So that created incredibly great opportunities, and the opportunities needed to be great because the needs are also really great and growing. And I think you'll get some sense of that from what our panelists will say. Over the past many years, there's been a growing epidemic of mental health disorders, including substance use disorders, throughout the state and the country and the world, and these have been particularly great among young people. It's been the source of great consternation, and California has really been one of the places that has sort of been leading in attempts to try to solve this problem. And this was all true before the pandemic, and one of the most salient features of the pandemic is that the problem has just gotten much, much worse, and particularly in marginalized populations. And so, so again, the needs are great, the opportunities are great, and we're going to hear from our panelists about how they see it from their different vantage points. So we're going to start with Aparna.
Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Aparna Bhaduri. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Chemistry here at UCLA, and my lab studies human brain development and brain cancer. And I have some experience primarily working with, on the human brain development side, cortical organoids, which I think are one of the big opportunities, as well as one of the challenges that will be spearheaded by this CIRM initiative. One thing that I think is particularly salient is the opportunity of using these systems to really begin to understand with more depth and with the funding much more both foundational biology but also with translational relevance, the trajectories, the cell types, and the developmental events that really are impacted in individuals who ultimately will develop neurodevelopmental disorders, who have vulnerability to neuropsychiatric disorders, and the host of other things that Nelson nicely introduced. I think that this system in particular, which is a stem cell-derived three-dimensional model that has multiple cell types of the developing human brain, is really a unique opportunity because it allows us to look at the interaction of these populations with one another. But there are still challenges. One of the major challenges is, as exciting as the system is, and as it's revolutionized our access to human brain biology, there are still limitations, particularly with regards to its maturation and circuit activity, which are areas that are under active investigation here at UCLA by a number of wonderful scientists and across California and the country. And as these developments really improve the system, it'll give us a better opportunity to really be able to take this to the next translational level. And I think that the funding from CIRM will really catalyze this. Finally, I think that Nelson alluded to this as well, but the stem cell lines that we have from individuals are not nearly as diverse or as well characterized as we need them to be to execute this work at a high level. And so I think that this needs to be a priority, and I'm excited to see how CIRM enables scientists and the community to really address that challenge in order to make the work that we do applicable to the most number of individuals. And with that, I will hand it off.
My name is Adam Leventhal. I direct the USC Institute for Addiction Science, and that's a transdisciplinary unit at University of Southern California that has 80 faculty across 7 schools at our university. And we're really trying to bring people together who've sat in their silos for a long time to really solve the addiction crisis. And as Dr. Freimer had mentioned, addiction, just like other mental health disorders, is one that is in crisis mode. We had 2 federally declared epidemics before the COVID-19 pandemic and the opioid crisis and youth nicotine vaping, and things have sadly gotten worse. So in addition, as part of that, our disparities have widened. So you can't talk about substance use disorder without talking about equity and social determinants. In terms of the implications for regenerative medicine, one of the challenges that we see in the field of addiction is that the market, both illegal and legal market for drugs of addiction, moves very fast. We have, I don't know how many different types of cannabinoids that are being commercialized with all sorts of different types of compounds in them. We have new forms of delivering old drugs. So as I mentioned previously, we have e-cigarettes in a way to aerosolize nicotine, inhaled nicotine, but with that comes exposure to a lot of different types of compounds in the vehicles and flavorings. And so the impact of that on regenerative medicine and how patients with comorbidities who might be experiencing or getting exposed to all these different types of novel compounds from their substance use is really something we know very little about. And there certainly is evidence that some of the classic drugs, like nicotine, does alter the regenerative process, but we need to do a lot more.
My name is Kelly Shepard, and I'm Associate Director at the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. I'm basically a program officer who works on a team that is administering and developing programs to support research at the basic and fundamental knowledge gaining stage through the candidate discovery stage, where these are then handed off to translational stage programs, and ultimately we hope they progress into clinical trials and new treatments for unmet needs. I've had the privilege of working at CIRM since 2009, so only a few years after we were originally established through the passage of Proposition 71, and I've been able to witness the evolution of this field from kind of the fundamental beginnings when we were just, what can we do with stem cells, to doing things with stem cells now, and seeing some of those earliest studies have progressed to clinical trials. So I've seen that many challenges and opportunities over the years have shifted, and I have a good perspective, I think, on what still needs to be done, specifically in the area of CNS. So as alluded to earlier, there is a $1.5 billion funding set aside in Proposition 14, specifically focused on overcoming challenges related to the central nervous system, of which neuropsychiatric disorders would fall. And I think that the challenges that I see fall into a couple of different categories. Some of them are at the scientific level, and Aparna did an excellent introduction to some of those. And so gives you a sense of what that is. And part of this is that these disorders are complex, they're multifactorial. It's been difficult to study them because they aren't well modeled in animal systems. So some of the challenges and opportunities we have before us have come from the stem cell field and advances in that, because now we can acquire human cells through induced pluripotent stem cell technology. We can coax them into becoming neurons and other cells that we think are important contributors to these disorders. And then we can study the basic biology. Now, that's one aspect of what's a challenge, but there are other aspects as well. And these are scientific as well, because while we have gotten pretty good at differentiating stem cells into different cell types, we're I would say we're still, and organoid technology has gotten much more advanced. I still think that we need to get even more complex and more advanced, and these tools, which are very powerful, need to be made available to more people. So just in the last year, after the passage of Proposition 14, our agency has developed a new strategic plan, and one of the major goals for the next 5 years is to set up a couple of new initiatives that will foster a culture of collaboration so that many of the investigations that are made by individual contributors in their research labs will be able to share data, to share resources, to share knowledge, so that the knowledge gain can be leveraged with one another and synergized. So I think I might be just about out of time, but I'll just reiterate that our basic approach to address these challenges is to continue to support basic research to address the most critical knowledge gaps to help us overcome our lack of understanding about the basis of disorders, which is the first thing we need to do to develop new therapies or new pathways to target for therapies, to continue to support those projects that have moved further along into development, to ensure that they can be translated as rapidly as possible, to make sure that we learn from those investigations, whether the clinical trials succeed or fail. Can we learn from those failures, and how can that inform what we do when we go back to the basic discovery and address those knowledge gaps? And finally, ultimately laying the groundwork at this point to create infrastructure for sharing resources, sharing technologies for modeling cells, sharing training and bringing the know-how to different parts of the state, to different laboratories, and ultimately creating a data infrastructure where data generated from the projects that we fund can be connected and collaboratively analyzed with other laboratories in California and around the world to better increase the likelihood that meaningful findings will come from this work. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And Marvin.
I'm going to stand and also use my Apple Watch to tell me when to stop talking, because I'm going to be talking about something that has been central to my career and my personal life for a very long time. So what I'm going to be talking about is the need to focus on co-occurring mental illness and addiction. I started to focus on this area when I was the mental health director in Bakersfield, and a client came to me who was turned away from the substance abuse side and from the mental health side of my own system because each side told him he had to do the other thing first. And so I, as the director, was going to fix this thing. And so I made a number of mandates to get this thing fixed, and failed miserably. And so as I became the mental health director in Los Angeles County, I also focused on this same problem. While I was in LA County as a mental health director, our son, who had a social anxiety disorder, had that social anxiety disorder turn into a severe addiction. And the addiction progressed over time to overdoses. And it took me as mental health director every effort I could do to try to find the right successful treatment for our son. It worked. He's now a graduate of a medical school and doing quite well. But it turns out that my role as the mental health advocate in CIRM is going to be focused entirely on trying to find the way that we can find the scientific basis for laying the ground for addressing the crisis that Adam described, which is far worse. The homelessness crisis, the crisis of addiction, the huge amounts of federal money that are coming in for the 988 program, none of that will work unless we get the policy, the practice, and the training right for co-occurring disorders. It's my hope that CIRM can provide entrepreneurs and scientists the ability to work together to find the genetic and experiential basis for the overlap between addiction and mental illness in such a way that we can develop the kinds of understanding, the scientific understanding that will create the mandate to change our policy, our practice, and our training so that addiction and mental illness are treated together whenever they occur? Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks to all of you for what I would call the introductory remarks, which we'll now follow up on. And I guess I'd just like to start because I think we've really heard, an incredibly broad range of problems. And on the one hand, I would say, Aparna, both from your description about the organoid work and Kelly, you're talking about what CIRM has supported and continues to think of it. I just wonder, is there a gulf between the way, for example, CIRM and stem cell scientists have thought about the problems that need to be addressed, and let's say the way Adam and Marvin have talked about these problems which are not even really that well defined, much less addressed? And what do we need to do to be able to bridge that gap between this incredibly focused developing science that has been focused on things like sickle cell disease or different immune disorders and so forth, to bring them where they could even have the right language to talk about something like co-occurrence of substance use disorders and mental health disorder that you take your pick. So I just wonder if anybody could address their thoughts about that, because I think really all of you hopefully have something to say about this.
So one of the things I'd have to say has to do with a conference I attended today, in which it was a really interesting opportunity to look at the genetics of that underlie particular illnesses and provide the patients the opportunity to focus on the things in their life that they needed to change in order to delay those risks and have a longer life. So I asked the question, have you been able to do that sort of thing with the risk related to mental illness and addiction? And the answer came back about the mental illness, but ignored the addiction component of my question completely. And I think that's one of the things that we always have to realize, that they are connected and together at each and every instance. And until both the innovators and the scientists find the basis for that, the problems won't get very much better.
I agree. I think there is a gap. I think there are a lot of gaps, and there are different types of gaps, but they relate from the same thing. It's because many of the people who care about this issue and are trying to overcome it are really subject matter experts in a somewhat narrow area. So we have scientists who are, have great in-depth knowledge around a specific set of questions in the model that they study. Now, that is well and good, but in order to really make breakthroughs rather than incremental advances, we need to have different perspectives. Right before this panel was one on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and there was a lot of discussion around the value of bringing different perspectives in to inform training, workforce development, and science and everything we do. It's also very important to bring in different perspectives when we're thinking about solving scientific problems and ultimately translating them. And by different perspectives, at one level, that means different disciplines of science. And this is what we're seeing now and what we're talking about with a culture of collaboration. We need to bring in people with expertise such as yours, who recognize that there could be connections between addiction and mental health and disorders at the genetic level that could be modeled at the cellular level. We need to have the perspective of patients to understand whether the problems we're trying to solve and the way we're trying to solve them is something that would be meaningful to them, right? The outcome measures. We need to understand whether the outcomes that we see in clinical trials tie back to the things that were observed back in the laboratory at the earlier stage. Was it predictive? Was the model wrong? Was the mechanism wrong? So all of these things we're attempting to address in one way or another. So through some of our foundational knowledge funding mechanisms, we're not only just asking people to explore new hypotheses, but we're asking people to take findings from what happened in a clinical trial, maybe that failed, go back to the drawing board and try to figure out why did it fail. Was your initial hypothesis wrong? Was it something that you couldn't test in a human cell that you could, or it wasn't reflected in the preclinical model? So I think bringing in these different perspectives and from different disciplines, and this is one of the reasons that I personally am really excited about getting computer scientists and computational biologists involved in our future initiatives to help the sharing and creating an infrastructure so that data can be more widely shared. In addition to the perspectives of different scientific disciplines, different individuals representing different populations and patients, I think it's very valuable to have the perspective of community leaders and individuals with expertise such as yours that can inform the scientists, because everybody's goals are to help, and I think we can do more together than we can alone.
And I'm happy to comment. And then I think Marvin said it well. Addiction and mental illness. It's rare to see them without one another. In terms of gaps, I think I really like what you were saying, Kelly, about bringing different scientists in the room. It's something that we've had a lot of success on at USC. I think that understanding that addiction and mental health, they're very strongly environmentally determined and socially determined. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't use stem cell technologies to learn and understand the basis of these disorders or potentially even other disorders, right? But in order for something like that to happen, you need to get creative minds thinking. So the experience of discrimination and racism, how can we model that somehow in vitro or in vivo? It's difficult, right? And so this is something that we've struggled with a lot in terms of it's a different type of a stressor. It's not just your average stressor. It's intractable, it's enduring, it cannot be escaped. So I think getting some of those folks together with the basic biologists, basic neuroscientists, I think those types of creative ideas can be spawned, and there could be back translation as well. So.
And Kelly, I'm really glad you brought up the issue of DEI, because in terms of treatment of illnesses, of course, there's a DEI disparity in almost all of them. But in my experience, it's even greater than most diseases in the treatment of mental illness, and even greatest in the DEI treatment of addiction, which for many underserved communities is jail and prison rather than treatment at all. And so I think trying to find the right scientific basis for showing policy leaders what they need to change would be such a great contribution that CIRM could make.
I'd just like to add that, as a molecular and cellular person, rather than someone who necessarily on a daily basis is thinking at the level that Adam and Marvin are thinking at, it's always good to get that perspective. And I think that there are ways in which we can try to incorporate some of these kind of bigger societal environmental factors into the experiments that we do in a dish. And it's never going to be a perfect model, and it's important to always consider, what can or cannot be modeled in a dish or in a mouse. But I think that Kelly's point of how we can look at failures and we can look at some of the mechanisms of things that did not work, and also to understand the mechanisms of things that might be working, that are more therapeutically interventional, or that can have controlled experiments with environmental factors that can look at things like impacts on cell types and impacts on connections. That these are places that we can start, but this is definitely a big bridge between those different scales, and it's something that we as molecular biologists really need to keep in mind when we're doing our work.
So in these days of Zooming, my latest Zoom was with the DEI working group for CIRM. And one of the things we're trying to do right now is to figure out how we evaluate the DEI potential of applications that come our way. And so there's going to be charts and forms and procedures that the applicants are going to have to utilize. But one of the things, in my experience, as mental health director that was most useful in dealing with DEI activities is not to go and presume I knew anything, but rather to go to the communities and ask. And working with Dr. Ken Wells from UCLA, we had a really wonderful experience in South LA trying to find the ways that African American communities could deal with depression. And we found some really wonderful community-based strategies that Dr. Wells was just telling me he's still getting publications out of. So the opportunities when you go to a community and really listen can be amazing.
Okay. So thanks everyone for those set of comments. You know, one of the things that occurs to me is, you know, is that we can't talk about scientific advances in the vacuum of where we are as a society. And, you know, I think one of the things that we've all recognized over the last couple of years, for example, around issue of vaccination, is that it can be really hard to achieve a consensus around a lot of the topics that we might be interested in. And, you know, and so CIRM was refunded through, you know, through a very, very bare majority of the voters, I must say, but still by, you know, by a democratic process. But I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, you know, over the coming several years. How are we going to, what is it that we need to do as, let's say, as scientists and as people trying to, you know, really engage the public to really try to get people to understand the value of what we're doing? And I can just imagine that as hard as that is for regenerative medicine generally, it may be really hard for mental health and substance use disorders. And, you know, sort of the last thing that I thought about with this is, you know, listening to the radio this morning about the debate, you know, after the absolutely horrendous shootings that occurred this week, you know, between the discussion about whether this is a gun issue or a quote unquote mental health issue. And it just made me realize that the way we talk about mental health in society, you know, is potentially very polarizing and polarized itself. I'm just wondering how you think that this may relate to the impact of the next several years with CIRM if we focus on these problems.
I'm happy to take a crack. I think it's important to understand where different people and communities and their viewpoints are. Now, everybody in here, I think, is a scientist or believes in science, right? But I think just coming up and dismissing people who come with views of skepticism or other types of views that we feel might interfere with our progress, you know, just standing and saying the same thing and saying, you're wrong, we're right, I don't know if that's going to advance the issue. I think we need to understand where people are coming from, why they have these views, why there might be mistrust. And there's a history of that in a number of different communities of mistrust of the medical system, mistrust of science. And I think from there, understanding where that comes from, we'll be in a better position to, I think, convey our message and then also, you know, meet the needs of what these different communities are struggling with.
I agree. I have to say that having one of my responsibilities at CIRM, in addition to administering our earlier stage scientific research programs, is I oversee our education and training programs, which our earliest stage we support our high school internships, undergraduate students, masters, and PhD and postdoctoral scholars. And although many of these programs have been going on for a decade now and have always had a focus on trying to increase the diversity of the workforce, it's really educated me in many ways as to where a lot of the disparities are and some of the challenges in overcoming them. And this is all really, I mean, as much as I learned administering those programs, it was nothing compared to what I learned during this whole past few years during the pandemic and seeing people's hesitancy around vaccines and science in general, the distrust, and starting to think about how to reach and message in those individual communities when there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all message. Every community is different, has its own different questions and different historical perceptions of what science is about and how it may or it may not help them. We all know that somebody preaching from an ivory tower into communities about how we're going to come in and help you is not well received or trusted. That's not the type of messaging that's going to work. And personally, as somebody who hasn't been in these communities, I'm not a person who could come up with the messaging for that. And so one of the things we do at CIRM is we challenge people who apply for grants to come up with novel and innovative strategies to do this. And every one of our training programs now includes requirements that the individuals who are trained, who become the future workforce, the future leaders, have some kind of activities where they learn community engagement. And more specifically, if we're able to increase the recruitment of individuals from underserved and underrepresented populations, and it'll bring their perspective in how to communicate with their communities, and they can take that back and share those lessons. And the last thing is, you've already heard that I worked at CIRM for a long time, so you could probably get the idea that I'm a little bit older, and I was educated before social media became a thing, and I'm not very adept at using it. I think we need to get a lot more young people and community activists involved who know how to message and know how to target the messaging to different groups so that we can increase our message and increase the effectiveness of our messaging, because we all deserve to benefit from this technology that the entire state is helping to support.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.